They told me I'd never make it without them, that I was worthless, delusional, and too soft to survive on my own. Now, I'm standing in the marble foyer of my dream mansion, the one I bought with the money they swore I'd never earn. And guess who's knocking at my gate now? My brother, my ex-husband, and the in-laws who left me homeless. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Marla Keene, and 5 years ago, I was the kind of woman people walk over. I worked hard, helped everyone, and trusted too easily. My husband, Trevor, said he loved me, but what he really loved was control. My brother, Wade, always came to me for money just until payday, which never came. My in-laws said I was lucky Trevor even married me. I believed them all because I wanted peace. Then one day, peace shattered. I came home early from work and found Trevor laughing in our kitchen with my sister, Laura. They didn't even look guilty. They just stared at me like I was interrupting. When I confronted them, Trevor told me it just happened, and that he was happier with someone who understood him. My sister said I'd get over it. My brother took Trevor's side, saying I was dramatic. Within a week, I had no husband, no family, and no home. Trevor's parents kicked me out, saying I wasn't welcome anymore. I packed what little I had into my car and rented a tiny motel room. For the first time, I realized no one was coming to save me. I started cleaning houses to survive. Every morning I'd wake before sunrise, drive across town, and scrub floors for people who didn't even look me in the eye. I'd see their big houses and think, one day, I'll have one too. Not out of greed, but to prove I could. Then I met Eunice Holleran, an elderly woman who treated me with kindness. She owned a big old house that needed care, and I worked for her for almost 2 years. She became like family to me, something I hadn't felt in years. When she passed away, I was heartbroken, but she left me a small inheritance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start something. I used that money to open a small property business. I managed rundown homes, flipped them, sold them, and saved every penny. It took years, but slowly, I built something real, something mine. And last month, I bought my dream mansion. It's beautiful, tall windows, quiet halls, a place that finally feels safe. Now, when I hear the knock at my gate and see the faces of the people who abandoned me, I don't feel anger. I just smile. They wanted me to fail. Instead, I built a life so good they can't stay away. Before everything fell apart, I thought I had a family that loved me. I didn't see the pattern, not right away. It started small, little favors, harmless requests, the kind of things family is supposed to do for one another. But with time, I became everyone's solution, everyone's safety net, and nobody's priority. My brother, Wade, was the worst at disguising it. He had a way of smiling when he wanted something, calling me sis, in that soft voice that always made me feel guilty for saying no. He never asked directly. He'd complain about rent being late or his truck breaking down and wait for me to offer. And I always did. Every time. He knew I would. Once, he even asked me to co-sign a loan, saying it was just for a few months. I paid it off when he disappeared. When I brought it up, he said, "You've always been better with money than me. You'll manage." Then there was Trevor, my husband. He didn't drain my bank account the way Wade did. He drained me in smaller, quieter ways. He liked to point out how lucky I was that he put up with my moods. He'd joke in front of friends about how I couldn't handle real stress. I used to laugh along, pretending it didn't sting. But every night, when I came home after working 2 jobs, I'd find him stretched out on the couch, scrolling through his phone while dinner waited to be made. He'd look up just long enough to ask if I'd remembered to pay his credit card. His parents, the Claytons, treated me like I was part of the furniture, useful, but only if I stayed quiet. Mrs. Clayton once told me, "You're not exactly a career woman, are you? But at least you keep a tidy house." I worked morning shifts at a diner and evenings doing bookkeeping for a local shop. Yet to them, I was lazy. Mr. Clayton said I should be grateful Trevor didn't expect more from me. They'd host dinners at their house and make me serve drinks while they talked about real accomplishment. It wasn't always like that, or maybe I just didn't notice. In the early years, I kept telling myself they'd come around. I thought if I worked harder, they'd respect me. When Wade called at midnight saying he needed money just to get through the week, I'd drive across town without hesitation. When Trevor yelled because I forgot to buy his favorite brand of beer, I'd apologize and promise to do better. When Mrs. Clayton criticized my clothes, I'd smile and tell her I'd take her shopping advice next time. I started to fade under all of it. My own voice disappeared. My needs came last because I thought being good meant being useful. Every dollar I earned went to someone else. Every free moment was spent fixing someone else's problem. And the more I gave, the less they saw me as a person. There were days I'd stand in the shower, exhausted, and think, is this all my life is going to be? But then I'd dry off, put on a smile, and tell myself tomorrow would be different. It never was. Looking back now, I see how they fed off me, piece by piece. Not out of love, but out of habit. I was their comfort, their backup plan, their silent provider. They didn't care if I broke, as long as I kept giving. And I did, until the day I couldn't anymore. It was a Thursday night, and the air outside felt heavy with summer rain. I'd left work early for the first time in months. My manager had insisted I take the evening off, saying I looked worn out. I remember thinking I'd surprise Trevor with dinner, maybe watch a movie, maybe just talk like we used to. I bought his favorite takeout and drove home, humming to myself, imagining a quiet evening. When I unlocked the door, the first thing I heard was laughter. Not the kind that fills a room with warmth. This one was sharp, familiar, almost intimate. I froze. The smell of red wine hit me next, mixed with the faint scent of the candle I'd lit that morning. I walked toward the kitchen, each step slower than the last. They were there, Trevor and Laurel, my own sister, standing close together by the counter, 2 glasses of wine in hand. She was wearing one of my shirts, loose on her, and his hand rested on her waist like it belonged there. They didn't notice me at first. I watched them for a few seconds, long enough for the truth to sink in. When Laurel finally turned, her face drained of color. Trevor just looked annoyed, like I'd interrupted something small and inconvenient. "Marla," he said flatly, "you're home early." His tone was calm, too calm. I dropped the bag of food on the table. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. Neither of them spoke. Laurel bit her lip, then whispered, "It just happened." "It just happened?" I laughed, but it came out sounding broken. "In my house." Trevor rolled his eyes. "You're overreacting. We didn't plan this." "It's not what you think." I stepped back, feeling my stomach twist. I asked him how long, and when he didn't answer, I knew. The silence said everything. The next days blurred together. Wade came over after hearing what happened. I expected him to defend me, but he just sighed and said, "You always take things too far. Maybe they just connected better." I stared at him, wondering if my whole family had gone mad. Then came the Claytons. They didn't come to check on me. They came to protect Trevor's image. His mother told me I should take the high road and not make a scene. His father said divorces were messy and I should let it go with grace. I sat there on their couch, shaking, while they talked about my marriage like it was a business deal. When I refused to forgive him, Trevor changed overnight. He locked me out of our accounts. He told his parents I'd been unstable for years. My phone buzzed with messages from people asking if the rumors were true. I packed what I could fit into my car and drove away with nowhere to go. I called my mother that night, crying, telling her everything. There was a long pause before she said, "Maybe now you'll learn to stop being so trusting." That sentence cut deeper than anything else. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment, cold and final. I realized then that no one was on my side. I had lost my husband, my sister, my home, and even the illusion of family. When I looked at myself in the motel mirror that night, I didn't see the same woman. Something had cracked, but beneath that break, something else began to form, quiet, steady, waiting. The motel smelled like damp carpet and cigarette smoke. The wallpaper peeled near the corners, and the air conditioner groaned every few minutes. But it was the only place I could afford. My car sat outside, packed with the last pieces of my life, boxes of clothes, old photo frames, a few dishes. I stacked them in the corner of the tiny room, telling myself it was temporary, though I didn't believe it. At night, I'd lie awake on the stiff bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of trucks passing on the highway. The noise was constant, but inside me, there was only silence. The kind that makes your chest ache. Every morning I'd force myself up, wash my face in the cracked sink, and remind myself I had to survive the day. Finding work wasn't easy. I took a job cleaning houses through a local agency, driving across town in my old sedan with the back seat full of supplies. The pay was barely enough for rent and food, but I kept at it. The first house I cleaned was huge, white marble floors, chandeliers, gold-framed mirrors. I remember standing in that kitchen, wiping down the counters, wondering how it felt to wake up in a place like that and know it was yours. I couldn't stop picturing it. Every house told a story. Some smelled of expensive perfume and freshly cut flowers. Others felt cold, like no one really lived there. But they all had one thing in common. They belonged to people who had never worked as hard as I was working to clean them. I would run my hand over polished tables, imagining my name on a deed, a key that actually opened my door. The thought used to sting. Later, it started to drive me. Between jobs, I'd sit in my car and eat cheap sandwiches, scrolling through rental listings I could never afford. Sometimes I'd park outside a neighborhood full of big homes and watch the driveways, the gates, the people coming and going. I wasn't jealous anymore. I was studying. I was learning what I wanted and what it would take to get it. The pain didn't fade, but it changed shape. The sadness began to harden into something sharper. I stopped crying over what I'd lost and started thinking about what I could build. There was a quiet fury that lived under my ribs, steady and controlled. Every insult, every betrayal, every time someone told me I wasn't enough, it became fuel. One night, after a long day of cleaning, I sat on the edge of the motel bed, looking out the window. The neon sign outside flickered, painting the room in red light. I whispered to myself, never again. Never again would I be the person people stepped on. Never again would I let anyone decide my worth. It wasn't a plan yet, just a promise. But in that small, shabby room, surrounded by the scraps of my old life, I felt the first spark of something new, determination. And even though I had nothing, I finally knew I'd never stay there forever. The first time I drove up the long gravel path to Eunice Holleran's house, I almost turned back. The place looked like something out of a painting. Tall oaks lined the driveway, their branches stretching over the road like a tunnel. At the end stood a gray stone estate with wide windows and ivy climbing the wall. It felt intimidating, but I needed the work. I was hired through the agency to clean twice a week. When the door opened, I expected a stiff, demanding woman, but Eunice smiled softly and said, "You must be Marla. Come in before the wind steals you away." Her voice was warm, with the kind of humor that made you feel safe. She wore a faded blue sweater and smelled faintly of lavender. At first, I kept my head down and focused on the work. The house was enormous. 3 floors, long hallways, rooms filled with antique furniture that gleamed when the sunlight hit. I moved carefully, afraid to break anything. Eunice would sometimes follow me around, asking questions about my day, my favorite meals, what music I liked. I wasn't used to anyone caring about my answers. After a few weeks, she started waiting for me with coffee and a slice of pie. "You work too hard not to take a break," she'd say, pushing a plate toward me. I'd laugh and insist I was fine, but she'd give me that look, and I'd sit down. Little by little, I stopped feeling like just her cleaner. She had stories about her late husband, about traveling when she was young, about mistakes she made and never repeated. Sometimes she'd say things that stuck with me. "People show their true nature when you have nothing to offer them," she told me once. "But don't waste your heart proving yourself to those who never looked for your worth in the first place." I didn't tell her how much those words meant, but I carried them home every night. Months passed, then years. She began to lean on me more, small errands, grocery runs, helping with letters. On quiet afternoons, we'd sit by the sunroom window, watching the light shift through the trees. I think she saw something in me, something I hadn't seen in myself. One winter morning, I arrived to find the house unusually still. Her nurse met me at the door, eyes downcast. Eunice had passed in her sleep. The silence in that house was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. For a long time, I just stood in the entryway, staring at the staircase, half expecting her to call out for tea like she always did. A few weeks later, I was called to her lawyer's office. I thought it was about final payments or paperwork. Instead, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter in her neat handwriting and a legal document stating that she'd left me part of her estate, a modest inheritance, nothing extravagant, but far more than I had ever owned. Her note said, "You reminded me what purpose feels like. Now, use this to find yours." I walked out of that office with shaking hands. For the first time in years, I had something that was truly mine. Not a gift of pity, but one of belief. That moment didn't erase the pain of my past, but it lit a spark that changed the direction of my life. It was the start of everything that came after. The check from Eunice sat on my kitchen table for days before I touched it. I would stare at it every morning, half afraid to believe it was real. The numbers weren't large enough to change a life instantly, but they were enough to start one again. I didn't want to waste a cent, so I spent nights reading everything I could about small businesses, real estate, and repairs. My old notebook filled up with plans, crossed out ideas, and sketches of houses I could someday own. My first move was simple. I bought a rundown duplex at the edge of town. The roof leaked, the walls were stained with years of neglect, and the air smelled of dust and old carpet. Most people would have seen a disaster. I saw potential. I cleaned every inch myself, patched holes, and learned how to fix things I'd never even touched before. When I couldn't afford contractors, I watched tutorials late into the night, teaching myself how to rewire outlets and tile bathrooms. The first renovation nearly broke me. I worked 12-hour days, often sleeping on the floor surrounded by paint cans and blueprints. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when the plumbing burst, when my savings almost ran dry, when I looked in the mirror and saw someone worn to the bone. But every time I thought about quitting, I remembered that motel room and whispered, never again. When the duplex was finally finished, I rented it out to a young couple. The profit wasn't huge, but it was enough to keep going. I bought another property, an abandoned house with boarded windows. Then another. I started hiring small crews, people like me who needed a second chance. Together, we turned forgotten homes into places families wanted to live in. Each project taught me something new. I learned to negotiate prices, file taxes, read contracts. I learned that success wasn't about luck. It was about refusing to stop. Years slipped by, each one busier than the last. I didn't take vacations or buy fancy clothes. Every dollar I earned went right back into the business. I kept my head down, working through nights and weekends, slowly building a name people started to trust. Before I knew it, I owned several properties scattered across the city. The name Keen Homes began to appear on local listings, and calls started coming in faster than I could answer. Still, I stayed quiet about it. I didn't tell my family where I lived or what I did. I wanted my success to grow in silence. Then, one morning, I drove through a familiar neighborhood, the one where the Claytons lived. The manicured lawns, the wide driveways, the gleaming cars, it all looked the same. But this time, I wasn't the woman cleaning their floors. I was a business owner searching for her next investment. A few weeks later, I saw it. A mansion for sale at the end of that street. White columns, iron gates, big windows catching the sunlight. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement. I ran my hand over the for sale sign and felt something deep in my chest. When the papers were signed, I stood in the empty foyer and listened to the echo of my footsteps. This was the place I used to dream about while scrubbing other people's kitchens. Now it belonged to me. Every hour, every bruise, every sleepless night had led here. I had built something from nothing, and it was only the beginning. The day I moved in, the sun was bright enough to make the glass doors shimmer like water. I pushed them open slowly, afraid the moment might disappear if I blinked. The air smelled new, fresh paint, polished wood, faint traces of dust from the renovation crew. My shoes clicked against the marble floor, echoing through the wide halls. For the first time in my life, there was no one waiting to take what was mine. I set my keys on the kitchen counter and walked from room to room in silence. The house was enormous. High ceilings, long staircases, light spilling in through every window. I ran my hand along the smooth banister, then across the cool stone of the fireplace. Everything felt too perfect, too still. I wasn't used to quiet that didn't feel lonely. In the backyard, the lawn stretched to the edge of the property where a tall fence marked the line between me and the rest of the neighborhood. Beyond it, I could see the rooftops of homes I used to pass by when I worked near. Now, those same people would be my neighbors. The thought made me laugh under my breath. That night, I sat on the floor of the living room with a cup of tea. The furniture hadn't arrived yet, so I leaned against the wall and just looked around. The moonlight slid across the floor, touching the walls like silver. I could still hear the echo of my own footsteps from earlier. It felt unreal. This space that once existed only in my imagination now belonged to me. No signatures left to chase, no debts hanging over me, just peace. But small towns have long memories. Within a week, I noticed the stairs. People slowed their cars when they passed the gate. At the grocery store, whispers trailed behind me. I caught pieces of sentences, soft voices saying things like, "That's Trevor's ex," or "How did she afford that place?" It didn't bother me the way it used to. I just smiled politely and kept walking. Let them wonder. A delivery driver mentioned that the house used to belong to a retired judge, and now everyone in town wanted to know who the mystery buyer was. When they found out it was me, the questions started. Some sounded curious, others laced with disbelief. I'd nod, answer what I had to, then return home and shut the gate behind me. Each evening, as I walked through the halls, I felt the weight of what I'd built. Not pride, something quieter. Gratitude mixed with disbelief. I kept reminding myself, this wasn't luck, this was earned. Every scar, every sleepless night, every time I'd been dismissed or ignored, it all lived in these walls with me. Then one morning, the doorbell rang. It was early, the kind of hour when the neighborhood was still half asleep. I opened the door and froze. Standing on the front step was a face I hadn't seen in years, one that belonged to a life I thought I'd buried. My pulse quickened. I didn't move, just gripped the doorframe, waiting for the next word. My past, it seemed, had finally found its way to my door. The first one to show up was Wade. I saw his old pickup crawl up the driveway, sputtering like it barely had life left. I watched from the front porch, arms folded, as he stepped out wearing a wrinkled shirt and a face full of forced humility. He looked smaller somehow, shoulders slumped, eyes darting around like he wasn't sure he belonged there. "Hey sis," he said, forcing a smile. "Been a while." It took me a moment to answer. The last time we'd spoken, he'd told me I was too dramatic after my world fell apart. Now he stood in front of me, pretending like none of it happened. "I heard you bought this place," he said, looking around the property. "You really did well for yourself." I leaned against the doorframe. "What do you want, Wade?" He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Things haven't been easy. Lost my job a few months ago, then Jenna left. I'm just trying to make amends, you know? Maybe start over. Thought maybe we could." "Stop," I said quietly. "You didn't come here for peace. You came here for help." He blinked, surprised. I smiled, not cruelly, just tired. "You had your chance to stand by me, remember? When I needed family, you chose convenience. Now I'm supposed to forget that because you're struggling? He tried to laugh it off, saying I'd always been too sensitive. I didn't respond. I just stepped back and closed the door. His muffled voice faded as he walked down the path, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty. A few weeks later, it was Trevor. He didn't bother calling first, just showed up at the gate in a suit that looked borrowed, his smile as rehearsed as ever. I almost didn't recognize him. Time hadn't been kind. The charm that once fooled me now looked hollow. "Marla," he said, as if saying my name was some kind of magic. "You look incredible. I'm so proud of you." I folded my arms, waiting. "I know I made mistakes," he continued, "but I've changed. I'm not that man anymore. Maybe we could talk. Grab dinner." His words hung in the air, fragile and desperate. I let him talk, about his failed marriage, the business that went under, how lonely life had become. When he was done, I smiled faintly. "Dinner," I repeated. "Trevor, the only thing I'd lose my appetite faster over than your cooking is your company." He flushed, trying to laugh it off. I didn't move. "You should go," I said softly. "Whatever you're looking for, it's not here anymore." He opened his mouth, but I'd already turned away. The gate shut behind him with a solid click. The last visit came from the Claytons. They arrived together, dressed neatly, smiles tight and polite. Mrs. Clayton brought a pie as if this were a holiday greeting. "We always said you'd do well," she chirped. "You just needed time to find yourself." I invited them in, not out of kindness, but curiosity. They sat on my couch, pretending comfort, eyes scanning the house like inspectors. Mr. Clayton congratulated me on making something of myself. I listened, nodding politely, waiting for the moment they asked for what they really came for, a favor for their struggling son. When it came, I simply said, "No." They blinked, unsure they'd heard me right. I smiled faintly. "You left me with nothing and told me to be grateful." I did that. Now you can do the same. Their faces tightened, but I stayed calm. After they left, I stood by the window, watching them walk down the driveway. Each step they took away from my home felt like closing another chapter. They had all come back, one by one, looking for the same thing they'd always wanted, comfort at my expense. But this time, I owed them nothing. The woman they abandoned no longer lived here. The first to return after the awkward visits was Wade, still desperate and restless. He showed up one morning clutching a folder full of job applications, his eyes wild with exhaustion. "I've been trying, Marla," he said quickly, voice trembling. "Just can't get back on my feet. If you could loan me a little, just until I catch up." I watched him from behind my desk. The sunlight spilled through the tall windows, lighting the polished surface between us. I could see the reflection of his shaking hands on the wall. Slowly, I opened the drawer and pulled out a checkbook. His expression softened immediately, hope flickering in his eyes. I wrote the amount he'd asked for without hesitation. When I tore the check from the pad, I held it out. He reached for it, but before his fingers could touch the paper, I tore it clean down the middle. Then again, the sound of ripping filled the room. His jaw dropped. "What the hell was that for?" I met his stare calmly. "To show you I could have helped, but I don't owe you anymore." I gathered the scraps of paper and tossed them into the bin. "That's your lesson, Wade. You don't get to drain me twice." He left muttering something about ungrateful family, but I didn't care. The door shut behind him with a quiet, satisfying click. Not long after, Trevor appeared again. This time, he called ahead, saying he wanted to apologize properly. I agreed to meet him in the garden. When he arrived, he carried flowers, cheap ones, and wore the same cologne he used years ago, probably thinking nostalgia would do the work for him. He started with a speech about regret, about how life had been unkind since we separated. His voice trembled at just the right moments, like he'd practiced. "I made a mistake, Marla," he said softly. "I should have never walked away from you." I let him talk until he ran out of breath. Then I stood and said, "There's someone you should meet." I gestured toward the back door where Elliot, my fiancé, stepped out, steady, kind-eyed, the kind of man who never needed to raise his voice to be respected. Trevor froze, color draining from his face. I introduced them as if it were a polite formality. "Elliot runs the construction side of my company," I said. "He's been building with me for years." Elliot extended a hand. Trevor didn't take it. I smiled, calm and composed. "You see, Trevor, I didn't rebuild my life waiting for apologies. I rebuilt it with someone who never needed to hurt me to feel strong." The look on his face was all the closure I needed. Weeks later, the Claytons reached out. They wanted to put the past behind us and suggested a small family reunion. Against every instinct, I agreed, but on my terms. When they arrived, the sky threatened rain. I led them to a table I'd set outside on the patio, an old, uneven one with a broken umbrella that leaned to the side. Mrs. Clayton frowned, tugging at her jacket. "Isn't there somewhere more comfortable to sit?" I poured tea unbothered. "Oh, this feels right," I said lightly. "I remember sitting like this once while everyone else dined inside. Fitting, don't you think?" They didn't answer. The drizzle began, gentle but persistent. I offered no shelter, no comfort. I simply smiled and sipped my tea while they squirmed, realizing what this was, a mirror of their own cruelty. When they finally stood to leave, soaked and silent, I stayed seated. I didn't raise my voice or deliver a speech. I didn't need to. My silence spoke for me, louder than anger ever could. Watching them walk away, drenched and defeated, I understood something simple and sharp. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just living better than they ever imagined you could. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes late at night. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking through the calm. I wandered through the hallways barefoot, the floor cool beneath my feet, every step echoing softly against the walls. The chandeliers glimmered faintly, catching the moonlight from the high windows. It was peaceful, untouched, mine in every sense of the word. I paused at the grand staircase, running my fingers along the smooth railing. The air inside the mansion felt warm, filled with a kind of silence that wasn't empty anymore. It was the kind that let me breathe. For years, I'd lived with noise, arguments, criticism, demands that never stopped. Now, the only sound that mattered was the quiet rhythm of my own heartbeat. As I walked past the study, the light from the fireplace flickered across the walls. I glanced at the framed photos on the shelf. The first house I renovated, the company's opening day, a picture of me and Elliot laughing over blueprint. Little reminders of how far I had come. I wasn't just standing in a mansion. I was standing inside every version of myself that had refused to give up. Down the hallway, I stopped before a tall window overlooking the hills. In the distance, beyond the rows of trees and rooftops, I could just make out the faint outline of a smaller house. Their house. The one where Trevor and Laurel had once lived. The windows were dark now, the yard overgrown, the driveway cracked. Time had taken what they once thought was perfect. I stood there watching, the past flickering in my mind like an old film, voices raised, laughter that wasn't real, the sound of a door closing behind me for the last time. I had imagined this moment for years, thinking I'd feel triumphant, maybe even vindicated. But standing there, looking at the shadow of what used to hurt me, I felt something different, something lighter. It wasn't pride, it was release. The anger that had fueled me for so long had burned itself out, leaving behind a quiet understanding. I walked to the balcony and opened the glass door. A cool breeze swept in, carrying the scent of wet grass and jasmine. The sky was clear, stars spread wide above the treetop. I leaned against the railing, letting the air wash over me. The weight I'd carried since that first night in the motel was gone. What replaced it wasn't joy or sadness. It was peace. For so long, I thought family meant loyalty, sacrifice, and forgiveness, no matter the cost. Now I knew better. Family wasn't about blood or obligation. It was about who stood beside you when everything fell apart, and who didn't. I turned back toward the hallway, the firelight stretching across the floor in soft gold line. At the end of the corridor stood a door I hadn't noticed before, a simple one, painted white. I walked toward it slowly, turned the handle, and stepped inside. The room was empty except for a large window overlooking the same darkened neighborhood. I stood there quietly, taking in the silence. Then, for the first time in years, I smiled, not because I had won, but because I finally understood what it had all been for. The last door had opened, and on the other side I found myself. Do you think I did the right thing by walking away from them, or should I have given them one more chance? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.